Let's go back to two logical operators that we already used before, but we didn't use their full potential yet. And I'm talking about the AND operator and the OR operator, and how we can use them for something called short circuiting. So up until this point, we have used logical operators only to combine Boolean values. But the truth is that we can do a lot more with the AND and OR operators. So let's start with the OR operator here. And so let me log 3 or Jonas. So that's something that we didn't do before, which is to use basically non-Boolean values here as the operands. Okay? So let's see what the result of this is going to be. And for some reason I have to reload here. And you see that the result is 3. And so that means that the result of the OR operator doesn't always have to be a Boolean. And so that's something that I didn't show you before. So there are 3 properties that I didn't tell you before about logical operators. So first, they can use any data type. They can return any data type. And they do something called short circuiting. Or as we also call it, short circuit evaluation. So in fact, here we used 2 values that are not Booleans, okay? And it then returned a value that was not a Boolean. And now about short circuiting. In the case of the OR operator, short circuiting means that if the first value is a truthy value, it will immediately return that first value. So that's exactly what we see here with the 3, which is a truthy value. So again, if the first operand is truthy here in the OR operator, then the other operand will not even be evaluated. So JavaScript will not even take a look at it. And so that's what we mean with short circuiting. And now let's do some more. Let's use the empty string or Jonas now. Then let's say true or 0. And then let's say undefined or null. And now before taking a look at the result, try to take a guess of what the result of these 3 operations here will be. So did you do that? So let's see. So the first result of this one here is Jonas. And so that's because this here is a falsy value. And so then the second operand will actually also be evaluated, and that's Jonas, and it will then be returned. And so here we see again that the result of the OR operator doesn't have to be a Boolean. It will simply return the truthy value here. Next up, we have true or 0. And so this first value here is truthy, and in fact, it's even true, and so therefore that will simply be the result of the operator. And so that's what we see here. And then here we have undefined or null, and as you already know, undefined is a falsy value, and so we then go to the second operand, so there is no short circuiting, and so that's then the one that's going to be returned. So here we see null, and that happens even though null is also a falsy value. And let's actually now generalize this to more operators, so I can give you basically the general rule of how this operator works, no matter with how many values. So let's say undefined or 0 or empty string or hello or 23 or null. So what do you think that the result of this one will be? And it is hello. And that's essentially because hello here is the first truthy value in this chain of OR operations. So we start with this one. So undefined is falsy. And so then we go to the next one, which is also falsy. And so then to the next one, which is also falsy. And then we get hello. And hello is truthy. And so therefore it will short circuit the entire evaluation and it will be the returned value. Okay? And if we think about this, then it actually makes sense. Because remember, in the OR operation, the result is true if at least one operand is true, right? So if the first operand is already true, for example, as it happens here, then JavaScript doesn't even have to look at the other values, because the result of the expression will already be true anyway. And so it will short circuit and then simply return that first result. And now let's see a more practical application of this. So let's say that there might be a property on the restaurant object with the number of guests. So something like this, restaurant.num guests. But again, we don't know if it exists. However, we want to basically define a variable based on this number of guests, and we want to set a default value if this doesn't exist. So basically, what we want to do is this. So guests, I'm going to call it 1 here. And so what we want to do is this. We want to check if it exists, and then the result should be actually restaurant.numGuests. But if it doesn't exist, then we want to set a default value of 10. So let's log guests1 to the console. And so you see that now it is 10. And so that's because restaurant.numGuests doesn't exist. So this is undefined. And so therefore 10 will be the result of this ternary operator. Okay, but now if we do set the property like this, for example, to 23, then guests1 is going to be 23. So, but instead of doing this, we can take advantage of short-circuiting and the OR operator. So let's again write restaurant.numGuests and then simply OR 10. So let's analyze why this works. And first actually store this into a variable. So guests2 equals this, and then console log guests2. So let's take a look at why this works, and starting again with disabling this. And so right now, restaurant.numberOfGuests is undefined. So it's a falsy value, and as we already know, then the second value here will be the result of the OR operator. And so that's basically our default value of 10. So let's take a look. And indeed, we get 10 here. But now if we put it back on, then restaurant.numberOfGuests is now 23, which is a truthy value. And therefore the OR operator short circuits and it will become the return value, or let's say the result of the operation. And so now indeed we get 23. And so this is a way easier method of setting default values than having to deal with this ternary operator, or even worse, an if-else statement. Okay, so that is short-circuiting with the AND operator, but we can also do the same with the OR operator, but the AND operator also has short-circuiting. So let's take a look. And we'll start by log something to the console here, like a string to separate, so that we don't get confused by the results in the console then. Oh, but before we talk about the AND operator here, there's actually one more thing that I need to tell you here, which is that both of these solutions here, this and this, will not work when the number of guests is 0. So let's see what happens. And so now they're both 10. And that's not the result that we want, but given what we already know, it makes sense. Because this is now 0, so it's a falsy value, and therefore the second one here will be the result of the operation, and therefore assigned to guests 2. However, 0 is the real number of guests, and so that's the value that we actually would guests 2 to have. But instead, it set the default value of 10. So that's obviously not what we want, and we will explore a great solution to this problem actually in the next lecture. But now, let's talk about the AND operator. And basically, when it comes to short circuit evaluation, the AND operator works in the exact opposite way of the OR operator. So let's see, 0 and Jonas. And now the result of this is 0. And so what this means is that the AND operator short circuits when the first value is falsy, and then immediately returns that falsy value without even evaluating the second operand. So again, that's exactly the opposite of what happens with the OR operator, which short circuits when the first operator is true. So let's now set it to a true value here, or actually a truthy value. And then in this case, Jonas is actually returned. So when it is truthy, it means that the evaluation continues, and then simply the last value is returned. And once again, this makes sense if we think about it. So the AND operator is only true if all the operands are true. And so if the first one here is false, then it means that the entire result of the AND operation will already be false anyway. And so there's no need to even look at any of the other operands. So I think that's a good way to memorize how both of them work. Anyway, let's again generalize this to multiple operands here. And 23, and null, and Jonas. And so what do you think this time the result will be? Well, let's see. And it is indeed null. And to understand why, let's apply the same logic as before. So this is a truthy value, and therefore the evaluation continues. 23 is also truthy, but then null is a falsy value, and therefore the evaluation no longer needs to continue, because at this point the whole result of the AND operation is going to be false anyway. And then as a result, this is then simply the value that's going to be returned, and it short circuits the rest of the evaluation. So it will not even take a look at Jonas here. All right, and so now let's see another practical example. So let's say if restaurant.order pizza. So basically we're checking if this method exists, and then if it does exist, we want to call it. So restaurant.order pizza, let's say with mushrooms and spinach. So many times we can use the AND operator to actually avoid an if statement like this one, where all we want to do is to check if a certain property or value actually exists. Okay, so in this case here, what we're doing is to basically pretending that we don't know if order pizza exists. And so we first check if it exists, and only then we execute it. And so this now gives us mushrooms and spinach, but with the knowledge that we gained about the AND operator, we can do this in a simpler way. So we can say restaurant.order pizza and then basically if restaurant.order pizza does not exist, so it's undefined, it will then short circuit the evaluation and nothing else will happen. And so that's essentially exactly the same as this if block here is doing. All right, but if it does exist, so if it's a truthy value, then the second part here will be evaluated. And so here in this second operand, we can then call the function. Okay, and it's perfectly fine to use this operand, this second operand here, to call a function. We can put anything here. It doesn't just have to be a single value. Now, I'm not saying that you should go ahead and replace all your if statements with the AND or the OR operators. So please definitely don't do that, because it's going to make your code very hard to read in the future. But anyway, let's now summarize. So the OR operator will return the first truthy value of all the operands, or simply the last value if all of them are falsy. So that's what happened here, right? On the other hand, the AND operator will return the first falsy value or the last value if all of them are truthy. And as for practical applications, we can use the OR operator to set default values, and we can use the AND operator to execute code in the second operand if the first one is true. So play around some more with this maybe, and then let's just move on to the next video where we will solve this problem that we had here with this OR operator and this 0.